we are here to show the Bower, which is the reuse of several buildings, the addition of some more buildings, and the creation or the reinvention of a small piece of London. For those of you familiar with London, it's top right, it's on the way to the East End, in the great move to the east that London has seen in cultural and economic ways over the last 10, 20 years. The map would previously have been centred somewhere way off to the left-hand side, but this is now increasingly the middle of town. It wasn't always. It was once a sort of collection of rookeries and desperation, and our site had a lunatic asylum on it, which Charles Dickens went to when researching his social work, and that was replaced in the 1960s by a sort of commercial modernism, which was drawn up by Cecil Elsom, who went on to form Elsom Pack Roberts, now EPR. And this building and the building behind it, just on the left out of shot, were built for British Telecom, as some offices in this tower on the front, and as a warehouse at the back to print their bills. And this was part of, the swinging part of London at the time. The Beatles had their photograph taken outside. You can see the building in the background. But it wasn't built to last. And that, in a sense, is one of the stories of this project and the reuse of buildings. So only 13 years later, the cladding of the front building had failed so badly that it was stripped off and it was reclad in this kind of parallax view, Dallas, Texas kind of astro wall, which we rather liked, but wasn't really doing that much for the city. By the 2000s, however, and you can now see a bit more of the urban context, so you can see that there's a big gyratory, a roundabout put in on top of a tube station in the foreground. By about 2005, David Cameron had cottoned onto this and had reinvented it as Silicon Roundabout. And like most central government initiatives to do with architecture, the effects of that were completely imperceptible. But the fringe of the city has changed in its character enormously, and this kind of clustering of tech occupiers has now grown and established itself as a kind of fringe to the commercial centre. Our client bought the buildings in 2015, and they were a really sad collection. So you can see the tower at the front, and you can just see lurking at the back a car park, which sort of sloped down from a grade level of a Mews street at the back into an undercroft condition to the tower building at the front. And what we therefore picked up was really a piece of Cartesian modernism sitting inside of the sprawling, evolutionary chaos of London. A big part of the story of this project from our point of view is the reuse of buildings, the reuse of, in this case, the frame of the front building and the majority of the back building. And as in the UK we are moving to decarbonise our grid, I think we're now at about 40%, it becomes ever more important to consider the carbon impact of the materials you're using, and in this case, keeping. But before we get into exactly what we did with the buildings, the point we would make about the scheme is that it's a reworking of a corner of London where previously the site was impenetrable to the public. Everyone walked around a very narrow and very busy public route onto City Road, and the environs of the site were pretty poor. Our idea in urban terms is therefore to create a new street or Mews condition, firstly by cutting a hole in the front building, and then lining one of the back buildings with a street, 7-metre wide street, adding and extending to buildings, and then creating these new buildings, which are in a sense stage set buildings to create the street and create a series of small courtyards, and the one to the bottom left is then a link building between the two principal buildings to get in. This is the public realm that just diagrammatically that is generated, and at the front there's quite a strong boulevard condition. Inside the site it's more nuanced. The new street is then activated with restaurants, entrances to office buildings, a small hotel, and bikes and all of those sorts of things. The entrance to the buildings as a whole might normally be positioned by an estate agent on the front where people could see it. Our commercially minded client was thankfully a bit more sensible than that, and they agreed with us that you could activate the site inside the site by creating a small new piazza and putting the entrances there. So just diagrammatically, to try to explain what we did, these were the buildings we inherited, these were the pieces that we added. This was the bit the client built first, so they built the invisible back part first. The reason for that is that the back building was a much better building than the front building. The front building was built short and mean. The back building was built tall and generous and robust as a printing warehouse. We therefore worked on the front building second. A very brief selection of plans to try to explain. You can see the car park there, how we took that to a street condition, Mews condition, and a series of courtyards. And at the same time, we were fortunate enough to be working on a site just across the road, sort of top right, for a different client. And therefore, we worked on the two together, in a sense, as a master plan of a new off-main drag route that links through from the tube station to the backlands of the eye hospital and the city off to the right. I'll talk a little bit more about the offices in a second. This is then the photographs of what we inherited, and you can begin to see on the right the back building, which was a bit of a brute, but actually cleaned up pretty well, has these kind of 60s Ben Nicholson bas-relief panels on the end. But the front building was the real problem, and the front building was where we had to think about the section quite hard. So in the case of the front building, you have a very narrow standard floor plan, 14 metres wide, double row of columns down the middle, intended to be cellularised. We've extended it by 5 metres front and 5 metres back, and all of those extensions are double height, and those double height stagger, so that every office floor gets a double height space and a single height space, and they can then be linked into doubles or triples. So you can see the original tower sitting within that. We've also added 3 floors at the top. So it becomes quite a complicated piece of construction to which we then have to add an architectural identity. Hang on a second. There we go. So that's a more detailed version of the section. Oh, sorry. Here we go. So there it is before, or at least with the frame off, and here is the front building afterwards, seen from one of the side streets across the road. And you can see that we've deliberately adopted a sort of classic modernist architectural approach to try to provide a united idea of identity across a range of different internal conditions. This is the car park at the back, which sloped down and is now a street, very active street, actually room enough for people to stop and linger, in this photograph on the left, focused on a little pub in a back street at the end. The front is a much more formal, colonnaded space, double height space, and that's the little piazza that we've created within the site, and the building on the left is the sort of back of the front building jutting out and creating some shelter with the entrance beyond it. This is the weirdness of what we inherited, with a lower level car park and an access to the back building through a tunnel from the front, and this is the position now with that raised up with the rainwater attenuation tanks in the new basement. So we're effectively creating a deck, which is a very 1960s way of doing it, but in this case, in order to link ourselves back through to the grade level at the front. And parts of that existing building then appear within, in this case, within the lobby. This is the connection back out where we cut a hole through to the front. There's a Jason Bruges sculptural piece on a light sculptural piece on the soffit of the lobby, and a long journey turned into a kind of arrival space to the core of the back building. These are the double height spaces that are running front and back of the tower building. This is the warehouse building with a much better floor to ceiling height, these rather nice mushroom-headed columns. And in all cases, both buildings, tenants have come in and now customised it again. So we're beginning to see the next evolution of life of this building, which demonstrates to us that it was not only the right idea to keep it all, it was after all debated whether or not we should knock the whole lot down and start again and build a new big tower to modern standards. But actually, we're beginning to find the flexibility that we knew was in the building emerging in the way that people are using it. So, for example, this is the space with a view of St. Luke's Church that we delivered, and this is the space in use now with a triple height staircase running through. And they're beginning to even cut holes in the new frames that we have put up. So that is the story of this project. And I guess, in a sense, at WAF, where you see a lot of projects that are glorious pieces of architecture but utterly extraordinary and, in a sense, dropped at times from outer space, this is a 350,000-foot building. It actually looks and feels like quite a contextual delicate neighbourhood scheme, trying to reinvent a little piece of city and make a new street. Thank you.
Yeah. Shall I? Okay, I have a specific question about the facade system.
Yes.
Because when I saw it, it just somehow didn't seem to be in the right time period somehow in my mind. And I think it's the white spandrel panels and the way in which somehow it's articulated. Tell us a bit more about the decision and how the facade functions, what it does, and how it the role it plays.
I'll just try and cycle back. There's a photograph I think shows, in a sense, the buildings together, which might prove quite useful. Hang on. Moment. Is it there? No. Because, of course, what we are doing is, that'll do, we are keeping a building at the back. So we have this warehouse building. We reglazed it, we re-insulated it, but it's got London stock brick, spandrel panels and exposed concrete frame. It's a very, very simple building, to which we then added these pavilions. So one of them is just creeping into shot on the right behind the tree. They then are the kind of bridge between what we thought the front building would become and did become, and the back building's retained architecture. So they use bricks, but they also use expansive curtain walling with fairly simple linear trims, horizontal or vertical. The front building, which was always going to be reclad, partly because the cladding had been shot to pieces originally, but partly because obviously we were extending it out, is then the building in search of an identity. And I suppose that's where the complexity comes, because it's not as simple as building a brand new building and finding yourself with perfect slab edge conditions and a core that's in just the right place and so on. Instead, the position when the frame goes up is actually quite awkward. You've got bits of steel, bits of concrete, lifts and stairs where you wouldn't necessarily plan them to be, and of course these side extensions projecting out over the pavement. So, and we have a north-facing condition and a south-facing condition with considerable difference on solar gain and all the views of the south. So we have to try to find what we believe to be the right thing, which is a heavily glazed architecture offering lots of views and daylight penetration into floor plates through those double height spaces, but also an architecture with a simple grid or a framed element and, as you say, spandrel conditions that begin to control heat gain and unite floors that are created in very different ways at different times into a relatively singular architecture.
Normal, you said you are adding in two facades, sometimes triple, sometimes double height
yes.
spaces. Normally we like to sit on the window. I like, for example. I have a nice view also. But here, now all the people will work here in the future are sitting somehow inside. And the circulation, can you show this image?
This one?
So it's a big winter garden in front of them, I feel like this. So sometimes they made some stairs. So it will depend which people are coming in or which firms, I think. But it's a new thing, you know. It's, I don't know if this, yes. For me it's a little bit, maybe it was just one floor, 2 floors is okay, but the whole building is like this. And somehow, and these are rentable spaces.
Yes, yeah, they're commercial spaces.
So they like to be like this? Or?
Well, the building's fully let.
It's a different approach.
So. Commercially very successful building. We always find that clients are in search of sort of generic office space that meets standards that are written down. And the more of it you deliver, the less value you find, because actually it's the unusual stuff that we all like. We all want our studios to be in unusual buildings. And here, the struggle, in a sense, was that the building was so basic, with a central row of columns, a frame that was not even worth exposing. It was so worn out that we had to find some of that character for each of these lower floors. We think the double height spaces do it. Tenants agree because they've used them quite creatively.
Can you show the space again?
Yeah.
Because now you will have new acoustical problems. People are moving when you are working, so it's a different type of working. That's why I'm asking.
The problem that we always anticipated was that of privacy and overlooking intellectual property, because a lot of these, this happens to be a fashion company, but they are also very prickly about their fast fashion, so they need privacy. So the debate was always about these upper floor windows, which could belong to someone else. We have buildings in London like Heron Tower, which have been modelled on what is now a relatively old-fashioned idea of little courts in the sky, triples, quadruples, Swiss Re is on that basis. But the dimensions of these buildings are often very grand, and you end up with significant problems with overlooking because of the way that you can see through them. In this case, it's actually a very narrow interzone internally, through which you'd have to peer down very closely to kind of cause that kind of problem.
You talked about it as being contextual, also with the new building on the other side, which you haven't shown us. I'm trying to figure out what that means in this context. You've obviously created a ground floor set of streets that function as essentially an outdoor retail court that connects to the rest of the city. But the big blocks are, what context do they belong to? Above the ground floor, what context do the buildings belong to?
The context of the area, which I showed that aerial image of a rapidly changing place,
right,
in my personal view, is an exposition of how in London we often struggle with taller buildings. We don't have a national culture of building really tall. There were some in the 70s, but there weren't so many. And there is now an explosion. And this area has a collection of really significantly tall buildings, up to sort of 40-floor apartment buildings, of which this is one. That is their context above ground. Their contribution to it is clearly, to an extent, defined by the buildings we inherited, because we're not moving them. And therefore, we think we have designed, in the case of the front building, the one with the new architectural identity, a relatively calm member of the club when other buildings around it are sort of fighting for attention.
This whole idea of the section you referred to, and even with an image of the work of Le Corbusier, was an inspiration for these double height spaces. And actually a change of the whole plan of the building, you could say.
Say that bit again, sorry.
So your section,
yeah,
with reference to the work of Le Corbusier, was a way of opening up the plan in a different way than the existing structure, not? And what you said about the office plans, when you showed them, you said, well, I'm going to talk a bit about more later on. I didn't fully get that, because what kind of type of companies are working there? Maybe this double height spaces could have been sort of breakout spaces, or maybe named a third space towards the work environment. What is it exactly? What this double height space can do more than only an infrastructural element in the building?
Okay, so I think the Corbusier thing, I've got an eye on the clock, in essence, is this thing about compressed space and grand space. So there were lots of different versions of 2 and 1, and 3 and 2, and scissor or not. But really the key thing, I think, was that in inheriting the front building, we always felt that it was so pinched that it would be like some of his bedrooms and other ancillary spaces. They get very compressed because, of course, at the same time you have the grandeur of the double height living space. The way in which, I'm sorry I didn't linger on the plans, the way in which they've been used has cheered us up, because we still thought, I guess a bit, I think it's what you're saying, we still worried that they would become the nice bits down the side and everyone else piled into the middle. And actually they've used it on the whole more intelligently, because what they've done, I'm just trying to get to a plan, is, so this was a very simple test plan. They've put all of the cellular space in the middle. No one's got a central corridor that runs through it, because no one likes that. It's aesthetically not how we plan buildings today. all of the workspace is pushed out to the perimeter. And actually, it's quite hard to walk down the length of the plan. It's now a journey, even in single-story demises. And of course, when you have the stair, it becomes a journey that loops across to reach the next one and up again.
Okay.
Okay.
Note to end on. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Indeed.
Thank
Please
you.
accept your trophy.
Oh, yes.